Bom dia. É com grande prazer que damos início ao último dia do nosso 7º Advanced Seminar on Peirce's Philosophy and Semiotics e a 17ª Jornada de Estudos Peirceanos, eventos organizados pelo Centro Internacional de Estudos Peirceanos, o CIEP. Desde 1997, há 24 anos, o Centro de Estudos Peirceanos, inicialmente conhecido como CEP, posteriormente CENEP e atualmente o CIEP, fundado pela professora Lucia Santaella, realiza a jornada peirceana. Desde 2002, há 19 anos, o CIEP realiza também o Advanced Seminar. Eu sou Priscila Borges, diretora do CIEP, coordenadora geral dos eventos, que neste ano tem como tema Lembrar Peirce. Nesta terceira mesa, teremos o prazer de assistir à palestra do professor Fernando Andacht, da Universidade da República, Uruguai, intitulada Peirce's Most Timely Warning When the Axe of Dualism is Haunting the World, seguida pelos comentários da professora Lucia Santaella, da PUC São Paulo. Welcome, Andacht and Santaella. Thank you for finding time to be here and share your ideas with us. Andacht, the word is yours.
Thank you very much for this wonderful welcoming and invitation to see this wonderful community at work in Peircean ideas. And what a great challenge, which I already have benefited immensely from the previous talks and comments since Wednesday. And so it's always nice to come at the last for that very reason. And obviously, I thank my friend and colleague, Lucia Santaella, for taking time to comment on my paper. My whole point the title obviously evokes the famous Communist Manifesto, in which the specter of communism is haunting the world. And when I received the invitation, which I really appreciate, I thought, what can be the lesson? What can be the help that Charles Sanders Peirce, his pioneering and advanced ideas, that's a very nice idea to call it advanced seminar, because so much advance of his time and still so timely today. Then I thought, we are living a great hardship in the planet as never before. And this is the ultimate test for the ideas of someone who lived between 1839 and 1914. And what a difficult task to choose, a daunting task, a single aspect of the wondrous architectonic system that Peirce built during his so productive intellectual life. Not only are there a number of concepts and of substantial contributions made by the logician, but they're all closely and systematically related to each other because it's an architectonic. And since the focus of the 7th Advanced Seminar is discussing Peirce's legacy, the importance of why should we remember him today, evaluating his work, the work of a man who died over a century ago. That is why almost naturally, I would say even inevitably, the following characterization of what I believe is at the heart of triadic semiotic, of the entire architectonic that so wonderfully Peirce built about the generation of interpretants, semiosis. And this is the first quote. Maybe Felipe, ask you for help if you go my first slide, okay? Felipe will be clean enough, so I had a little problem with my computer, and so we'll be showing the slides, okay? Thank you. Okay, that's a title, okay? The dangers, before there is a little abstract. I thought an iconic abstract would be better, okay? To begin in a light mood. You must have seen this. I saw it the other day. Isabella Juncker already put it, and it's two cues. One is tense and is looking for answers that are simple but wrong, and the other is absolutely deserted, and it says answers complex but right. And so I think that Peirce is the place to go for a complex but right answer, whether the world is listening to him or not. And so now, yes, we go after this iconic abstract to the first serious slide. How does Peirce define in 1893 cynicism, which is at the heart of the generation of interpreters or semiosis? Cynicism even in its less stalwart forms, can never abide dualism, properly so called. It does not wish to exterminate the conception of two-ness, but dualism, in its broadest legitimate meaning, as the philosophy which performs its analysis with an act. Keep in mind that metaphor, so powerful, right? Dualism, not only in science, I will argue, but in everyday life, in the live world, as sociologists like to call it, is a terrible weapon, okay, which can diminish our capacity to understand not just the world, but ourselves, and a crisis like the one that the whole planet is living in real simultaneously. And so he says, dualism, in its broadest legitimate meaning, is the philosophy which performs its analysis with an axe, living as the ultimate elements, unrelated chunks of being, so not explaining anything. This, Peirce adds, is most hostile to cynicism. The cynics will not admit that physical and psychical phenomena are entirely distinct, whether as belonging to different categories of substance or as entirely separate sides of one shield, but will insist that all phenomena are of one character, though some are more mental and spontaneous, others more material and rare. Still all alike present that mixed freedom and constraint which allows them to be, nay, makes them to be teleological or purposive. That's 1893. A word of warning, caveat emptor, as it said in the shops in the United States. I do not intend to say what Peirce would have said about the so-called crisis or emergency or whatever you want to call it, and calling it is part of the problem, I think, of this crisis. I never would intend, but as Vincent Colapietro so beautifully said the first day, in order to catch up with Peirce, we must get ahead of Peirce, but realize in all humility that that is impossible, so we'll do the best we can. So in what follows, I'll do the best I can to profit from the lesson. Why it's so valuable? I would say our life depends on understanding what Peirce left us to understand problems, huge problems like this one. Felipe, please, the next one. The quote comes from an unpublished text, Immortality in the Light of Cynicism, that in the Essential Peirce, Volume 2, Hauser, another editor, says it was a fruitful period in Peirce's creativity. I quote, the opening writings of the present volume, from where I quoted, arose in the context of an active and ongoing program of research, end of quote. And they also assert the great importance of a notion that is so inimical to dualism. I quote again from the introduction of the second volume of the Essential Peirce, quote, cynicism would guide Peirce's philosophical investigations for the rest of his life, end of quote. I couldn't agree more. What I claim is that the defense of the principle of continuity and the warning about the risk that dealing in a dualistic manner, not just in science or philosophy, but in life, in how we handle this very hard to understand moment that is affecting the lives of others. I would be drinking a cafezinho with you over there, right? Chatting with you in the corridors, but I'm condemned to this window existence, right? This virtual, diminished kind of life. But what can we do? It's what we have. So what is my claim? That the negative reductionistic outcome of dualism as an analytical approach not only harms philosophy and science, it's also deleterious, destructive, when it prevails in the live world. This will be my whole point. There is like a battle going on between triadicity, teleology, final causes, and the brutal, efficient causation when it prevails, when it stops us from going all the way of inquiry, blocking the way of inquiry. Nothing blocks it so terribly as dualism. That's my contention. Please go on, Felipe. So here comes the most risky part, where I said, I don't know if Peirce would go with me, but I certainly think I'm going with Peirce by analyzing, in order to discuss the relevance of Peircean cynicism, a concrete situation, one which is very far from metaphysics, okay, from the wonderful close textual analysis that Vincent Colapietro did, or the philological effort of Francesco Bellucci yesterday for the symbol and the great comments of both, right? What Professor Ivo Ivry and Professor Pinfrenet did with the respective lectures. I will be discussing instead a concrete situation, one which is far away from metaphysics and maybe too close to the maddening crowd of worldly affairs. I will be telling you about the case of the harassing, the tormenting of a single human being in the name of health, of, you can say, official science, of the pandemic, how the life of a human being is dualistically and savagely destroyed when there is no fallibilism, when cynicism loses the battle, which can happen at any time. Please, Felipe, can you go on? And so, what I'm talking about, okay, is the dangers of dualism, Cartesian or otherwise, when it's used in an inquiry, okay? And what I'm saying is that there has been the creation worldwide of a ghastly rift. I checked in the dictionary, and it could be translated as a fenda or divisão, right? In Portuguese, a fenda. That is something that divides the world in good and evil, in healthy people or responsible people, and sick people, irresponsible, that should be destroyed, and so on. And that is the worst possible upshot, okay, according to the pragmatic maxim of this idea. So the creation, can you go on, please? The creation of a ghastly rift that unquestionably divides drastically good and evil, innocence and guilt in society is an illustration of what cynicism does not accept. Regarding this fatal flaw, I would like to quote Santaella. Please go on. I quote now from her classic work from 1992. I quote, "To understand fallibilism more thoroughly," wrote Lucia, "we need to resort to cynicism or continuity principle. Pay attention now, which is the notion of objectified fallibilism. That is precious to understand what's going on. The utter lack of the irritation of doubt in the way that dualism operates is the cause of much suffering, as I intend to show with one concrete case that I think can be multiplied all over the world. What is lacking in dualism is the teleological element, so essential in Peirce's philosophy. Dualism relies exclusively on efficient or brute causality, while cynicism assumes teleology, final causation operating in the universe. The glaring absence in dualism of what Peirce's account of personality describe as, I quote, developmental teleology is a daunting block of the way of inquiry. Can we go to the next? Metaphysics, however, does not deny the reality and intervention. I think it will appear now. Yes, the intervention of efficient causation in the world. Okay, please, another one. Okay, and another one. Okay, in the working of triadic semiotic, I quote, "To recognize the triad," wrote Peirce, "is a step out of the bounds of mere dualism. But," he continues, "to attempt to deny independent being to the dyad and monad, as Hegel-wise, is only another one-sidedness." Look how subtle our thinker is. By no means he's criticizing dualism by falling into dualism. I recall a short story, an essay of this great little epiphanic stories that Jorge Luis Borges left us, another great man I like to associate with Peirce. And he says that during the Second World War, he's invited to criticize anti-Semitism. And he says, "I do not believe in any kind of discrimination among people, so I went. I said yes." Okay, and then I heard in that big assembly that was supposed to conjure the evil of anti-Semitism, I heard said that German people who were not Jewish were worse, were evil. And he said, "But that's exactly what we came to criticize." And he adds in his wonderful, very soft philosophical way, "But nobody paid attention to me." So you see, the evil of dualism is always present, right? How can you combat dualism in a dualistic manner? The answer is you cannot. Please, to the next. But I have taken here a further risk. Please go on, couple more. I will deal with this global crisis with the help also of another thinker, René Girard, whose theory of mimetic desire I recently found in a book translated into Spanish by the works of Vincent Colapietro, which I was happy to present last year, or this year. It was this year. You see, with the windows, one loses sense of time. And in the face of the pandemic crisis, something extraordinary happened in my country, in Uruguay, where I live, from where I'm talking to you now. And that can be explained by René Girard's theory of mimetic desire. That is, what we desire imitates somebody. There is a model somewhere after which we are trying to do the same, get the same object of desire. And so I quote René Girard's classic work from 1987, where previously there had been a chaotic ensemble of particular conflicts. There is now the simplicity of a single conflict, the entire community on one side, on the other the victim. What he's describing, this French philosopher, is the creation of the scapegoat. Bode expiatorio would be in Portuguese, bode expiatorio. That is a person who is totally innocent, but who's chosen unanimously by society to cleanse itself of its anguish, of all evil, for example, from an epidemic, or even worse, a pandemic. Once the person is chosen and harassed to death, society feels relief, as in the Aristotelian catharsis, but in a horrible way. Please, the next. To relieve the anguish then caused by a feeling of imminent danger, pandemic, society uses the axe. There you see the metaphor I'm using, the axe of dualism. It finds a scapegoat, a bode expiatorio, with barely no evidence and most of all, no fallibilism. You see, a friend of mine invented the term the COVID orthodoxy, like a religion where nothing can be doubted. It's full of dogma. And it has the appearance of science, but science, official science. But there was never official science. Science is an inquiry. Peirce taught us, right? He defined the real, remember, as a community without definite limits, where nobody is not admitted, where we all can contribute our proverbial 2 cents, okay, of wisdom. But in this road, dualistic road, there is no fallibilism. And writes Girard, the surrogate victim, victime et misère, will eventually appear and reconcile the community with its death, with its sacrifice. Please, the next. So I will try to explain how, right, society condemns this scapegoat, okay? And here we have another great quote to explain what is this acquisitive mimesis. Democracy may be fine, but democracy makes us all equal, all the same. But human beings, according to Girard, and this is where he and Peirce diverge most obviously, Girard says in democracy we have this paradox. We love being equal to the next person, to our neighbor, but we want to be authentic, we want to be different, right? And how do we do that? By imitating what is called some role model, right? Somebody like Peirce, maybe, okay? Or Lucia Santaella, who knows? And this brings a conflict because we can never be authentic, because what we desire is somebody's desire. So I read now this wonderful idea from René Girard that I'm trying to pair with Peirce, as you already saw. Rather than the exhausted word imitation, I chose to employ the Greek word mimesis, without, however, adopting a Platonic theory of mimetic rivalry, which does not exist in any case. The only advantage of the Greek word is that it makes the conflictual aspect of mimesis conceivable, writes Girard, even if it never reveals its cause. That cause is rivalry provoked by an object, the acquisitive mimesis, which must always be our point of departure. A complete theory of human culture will be elaborated beginning with this single principle. What I'm trying to say is that through Peirce's description of desire, teleological self, right, as Peirce wrote, and Vincent Colapietro wrote this classic work in 1989, Peirce's Approach to the Self, I will try to show how when you want to dualistically exterminate a human being, you freeze the self, which is an ongoing, evolving process, into a single damned identity, like the witches that were burned, right, in New England in the 17th century. You identify the person in a sort of prison, frozen prison, like Dante's circle of hell. Please, the next. So I aim to make an unexpected partnership between Mr. Peirce and Mr. Girard. A combination of Peirce's triadic categorical model and Girard's theory of the conflictive mechanism of desire can shed light, I believe, not only on the case of a woman, because you can say, who cares What happened to this woman in Uruguay, which is a country is almost like Macondo, non-existent, a mythological little triangular country, right, between two giants, Brazil and Argentina. But I will argue that it's not only the case of a woman whose life was brought to a halt at the onset of the pandemic in this small Latin American country, but what I will talk about is a tragic worldwide situation, namely the ugly gaping rift, a fenda, a divisão, polarização, the ugly gaping rift that at present divides as with an axe mankind, not the fate of a single woman, I will be describing in some detail, but all of us looking at each other in total, you see, mistrust, in hostility. You see, the other became, as Jean-Paul Sartre famously said, l'enfer c'est l'autre, hell is the other. Now humanity may fall into that abyss, considering the other your enemy, and that cannot be worse. There is no worse fate for humanity than that. Please, the next. What is the most dangerous consequence of the dualistic acts? Well, a fundamental negative outcome of dualism is the lack of doubt, the absolute certainty, the glaring absence of fallibilism, which presides over the splitting of every phenomenon in unrelated chunks of being. The next, please, Felipe. And now I close my introduction by quoting the title of Lucia Santaella's 1992 classic book. What a beautiful title. The Signature of Things, a assinatura das coisas. That is the fine metaphor, finest metaphor for the synechistic working of the universe, where signs cannot be dualistically torn apart from everything else that they make intelligible, including ourselves. If they ask me now on television, where they give you like 30 seconds to define semiotic and its legacy, I would say that is the best thing that Peirce left us, a naturalistic theory of meaning, of the meaning of life, of ourselves, which is inseparable of the universe. We are part of it. Dualism tries to convince us otherwise, that we are one thing and nature is another, and so forth, right? And that this biological pandemic is just biological. That is, excuse me, my French, bullshit. It is not possible, right? It's all part of a gigantic unity, which is called the universe, right? And it's not just biological, as I hope to show. Please, the next. I will go now. Please, the next. I intend to analyze the unholy, the horrible polarization of a sanitary crisis due to its being associated with political and ideological elements by means of cynicism. I think cynicism can throw light on this chaos, on this confusion, right? And Peirce's sound critique of dualism. And now the next is a paper published in 2020 by the editor of The Lancet. I go to one of the most prestigious medicine journals, right? That has been in some kind of trouble recently. But in 2020, the editor, Richard Horton, wrote, COVID-19 is not a pandemic. Yes, you heard right. The editor of The Lancet, not just an ignorant semiotician like me, okay, who dwells in humanities and media studies. No, this is the editor of The Lancet. COVID is not a pandemic, it's a syndemic. The syndemic nature of the threat we face means that a more nuanced approach is needed if we are to protect the health of our community. What is a nuanced approach? Cynicism, not dualism. Please, the next. And now Peirce is opposed, I quote Colapietro here, I open to driving a wedge, that's a rift, between nature and culture such that the two are entirely separated from one another, so that the terms used to describe and explain natural processes are completely other than those used to characterize, interpret, and evaluate our institutional or cultural practices. End of quote. Please, the next. Now, when Peirce, I have to say where they coincide in the general nature of desire, but they diverge very importantly. For Peirce, selfhood is vanity, is a mistake. And for Girard, life is a zero-sum game. It means what I gain, you lose, like in fairy tales. So what is an important corollary of Peircean cynicism is the solid basis for the respect of the other, for our basic human rights. I quote, all men who resemble you and are in analogous circumstances are, in a measure, yourself, though not quite in the same way in which your neighbors are you. This must be kept in mind today more than ever. We are our neighbors. We are the same as you are. Until that is understood, we are in deep trouble. The next. Girard believes that the democratic vision of the human community causes a resentment that paradoxically is at the heart. Here I quote a text I learned about preparing my presentation for Vincent's book, 2020, with Charles Larmor. And he says, instead of recognizing the relations of dependence at work and consequently the existence of inequalities, one resorts to the image of a kind of pre-established harmony between equally authentic individuals. What Girard's analysis serves to make plain is that the principle established in the existence of free and equal citizens is countered, that is against the need every person feels to rely on models offered by others. Here we have trouble. The next. You see, polarization has never been so fierce, not even in a war, I think. The desire is general, I'll try to show. In a piece from 1895, it's a fragment not published, Peirce gives the recipe of an apple pie. An apple pie is desired. He uses the passive voice, observe. Desire, he adds, has nothing to do with particulars. It refers to qualities. Desire, says Peirce, is not a reaction with reference to a particular thing. It is an idea about an idea. Why doesn't Peirce say, I would love to have a brigadeiro, for instance? Because he is 54 years old at that point, and he has been brought up in America, North America, not South. And so for him, the idea of a delicacy is an apple pie. Had he been Uruguayan, what a wonderful dream, he would have liked a torta de dulce de leche, which cannot be translated, people, as a caramel-filled cake. But that is showing you that desire is always part of a community. It's always general. He's right. Next. And Larmor adds, we're led to invert the logical order, making out the model to be the consequence of our desire rather than its source. In short, and this is the heart of Girard's analysis, we end up believing that our desire is spontaneous or authentic. What I'm trying to say is that in the face of the present huge planetary crisis called pandemic, right? We're desperately looking for models, right? We're looking for an answer that is simple, but simple is wrong. And complex may be right, and cynicism may be the answer, but people haven't realized it yet. The next. Peirce would describe the conflict that we find in Girard's theory as an upshot of the way in which man, I quote Peirce, exaggerates some small particulars that he can keep to himself and his personality sadly. This reminds me of Freud's, remember? The meanness of small differences, which is narcissism. Next. What happens when cynicism is risk is because dualism is at full tilt, it's working at its full. Peirce's triadic model involves the growth of symbol. Quote, cynicism is founded in the notion that the coalescence, the becoming continuous, the becoming governed by laws, the becoming instinct with general ideas are but phases of one and the same process. And here comes the magical term, the growth of reasonableness. What I'm arguing is that since March 2020, there has been a constant diminishment of reasonableness, and we need to go back to Peirce to understand why and how to go out of that. Please, the next. Such a telic development can be seriously affected, I think, by the brute prevalence of dualism. This was sadly the case in the representation of the onset of the pandemic as told by the massive media narrative. It centered on a person falsely described as patient zero and relentlessly accused of all manner of foul deeds against humanity. This is the construction of the scapegoat as a monster. This woman, I will show you right now and go to my end, was accused of every possible crime of humanity, you see, but without any evidence, and more than anything, without any irritation of doubt. The next, please. The dominant narrative became, I'm quoting the top here, you may doubt what I'm saying, and it is good, you have to doubt everything one says, right? This is science. Ioannidis, since the beginning of the crisis, has been right. That is the only thing I can say. He's the top the world's top epidemiologist, okay? He's a mathematician and he does meta-analysis. He analyzes scientific analysis. And listen to what Jon Ioannidis of Stanford University, not a charlatan by any means, on September the 8th, 21, he published. The dominant narrative became, we are at war. When you're at war, everyone has to follow orders. If a platoon is ordered to go right and some soldiers explore maneuvering to the left, they are shot as deserters. Scientific skepticism has to be shot. No question asked. The orders were clear. This is terrible. This is dualism. This is the Cold War again. This is what we are not realizing yet. How can skepticism be bad? When Peirce wrote, remember, no is the pivot of thought. What is he saying? That we have to follow the road of inquiry, not to be satisfied smugly by certain dogmatic assertions. That is the work of dualism. The next. Now I will tell you about the appalling altericide of Carmela Ontu. That's the name of the woman. What was done to the wrongly called, totally wrong, I can show you in detail, but there is no time, patient zero of the pandemic in Uruguay was an altericide. I invented that term in 1987. If a homicide is the destruction of somebody's physical or material existence, killing somebody, an altericide, I claim, is the annihilation of her semiotic life, of her capacity to produce and exchange science as a valuable, respected human being. That was the fate of Marcela Ontu in the hands of a whole community. She was persecuted and destroyed semiotically. The next. I quote Colapietro again to show how great the damage done to a human being is, even when you do not kill the person with guns, when you weaponize media against her. I quote, the inner life of the human self, wrote Vincent, in its standing as a social actor is an expansive network of reflexive relationships. But relationships establish, maintain, and alter principally in the crucible of social relationships. The human animal is first and foremost a social actor, a being whose agency and sociality are so thoroughly interwoven as to form a single fabric. I think that Mr. Erving Goffman, the wonderful Canadian sociologist who left us the presentation of the self in everyday life and who I find a semiotician at heart, would be so happy, Vincent, with this idea. Please, the next. Now we talk about the lynching of Carmela in the altar of mimetic dualism. On March 7th, 2020, a woman largely unknown to the Uruguayan public did something trivial and private. An act that should have radically gone unnoticed. She attended a wedding together with 500 other guests in Carrasco, an upper-class neighborhood of Montevideo, a posh neighborhood. The next. Not only did social media vent their fury on her, they destroyed her, but also, pay attention, every newspaper headline, online, paper, which described Carmela as a super spreader. Listen to that, super spreader. The media even cited information of the National Health Minister of Uruguay that spoke about the Carmela vector. On March 13, 2020, when the government of Uruguay decreed the sanitary emergency, Carmela's virus went viral. The next. Why did the name and its owner, Carmela Ontu, become synonymous with the onset of the pandemic? That's my inquiry. You see, why choose a poor, innocent woman? 2 or 3 months later, a journalistic investigative program on TV showed that this was totally wrong. At the wedding, there had been at least 8 people who had arrived on that day or previous days, like Carmela, from countries where coronavirus, that is COVID-19, was already in an outbreak. So why choose her? Why only that woman? And then scientific studies show that since February, at least, there had been coronavirus in the waters of our country. So why choose her? Why make her the scapegoat, the bobo expiatorio? The next, Felipe. Okay, here are some images. Unfortunately, one has been moved. What a shame. I think Felipe maybe can fix it, maybe not. Why the pandemic scapegoat? You know, there is a phrase, a sexist phrase in popular culture in America, which is called resting bitch face. I know it's sexist, but it's common. It's when a celebrity is caught in a picture of the thousands of pictures that, you know, the paparazzi take, and she has a serious face, and it's called resting bitch face. I propose the term radiant posh face, because I'm saying that what was the biggest crime of Carmela was not spreading the coronavirus, which is absolutely absurd and illogical for the reasons I mentioned, but looking elegant, looking posh, belonging to upper class, and worst of all, being proud of her accomplishments as an entrepreneur of the fashion industry. You can see here at the bottom right, okay, what I call the iconic leg design or matrix of her persecution. It's a typical socialite, okay, who is reclining in a sofa and looking elegant with her own clothes because she's a fashion entrepreneur. And you can see a meme at the bottom left, okay, with one of the characters of The Simpsons. And one of the crazy accusations is that she was seen shopping at a mall. There was a video in which you can see far away a blonde woman whose phenotype is Carmela's, but then quickly somebody noticed that the shopping mall was in Argentina, in Buenos Aires. That didn't change a jot in the urban legend because she was seen everywhere. Her family members were seen everywhere, busy doing what? Spreading the virus everywhere, right? Killing Uruguayans. And that was not just in Uruguay, it was in Argentina. Some of these memes you're watching, okay, the tweets and the videos, they made videos with her, appeared in Argentina and in Spain as well. The next, please. I hope they have no, great. Here, I use the term untore from Giorgio Agamben, the Italian philosopher. He published a text in 2020 in which he speaks of an edict in Milano, okay, in the 17th century, in which the mayor of Milano was given a reward for finding the untore. The untore is the contagion agent. There was a character invented by the popular imagination who was spreading the pest, okay, the epidemic, by putting it on the doorknobs, on the windows, and a reward was offered. So she was named the scapegoat, the official untore in the media. Okay, and here we have two screenshots from an Argentinian TV show, a popular TV show, okay, where it says the Uruguayan infected 500 people. You see their face, there is an obsession which I call facial philia. As you have pedophilia, I invented facial philia. There is a passion with her face because she looks young, she looks pretty, she must be in her 50s, okay, and so on. And so there was a relentless media representation of the alleged contagion agent, or untore. The next, please. Felipe. And this is the maximum. For me, this is the strawberry on the cake. This is a transmedia example. An Argentine animation artist made a video, an animated video, you know with what? With a leaked conversation of WhatsApp, not of friends of Carmela. She talked to me after I published something. She got in contact with me, and they were not friends, but they were all posh. Their accents are absolutely patricinhas. In Brazil, you call posh people patricinhas, right? Refined, rich people who normally do not work, dress very sophisticated. So in this incredible video called Gente Rota, Broken People, okay, which went viral, you can listen to the actual conversation of these acquaintances who said, how stupid can you be? You see, they're in a solar bed, they're in a pool, they all have their cell phones, and they're saying, what an idiot, Carmela. So they're trying not to become the scapegoat by throwing her under the bus. That's exactly what happens. And also pay attention, not a single NGO, non-governmental organization, no feminist association came to the rescue. That is as amazing as can be. There's so much talk about gender violence against women only, but nobody opened their mouths, okay, during the lynching, okay, of, I checked in the dictionary, you know that pelourinho is the same as the torture instrument, right, that was used in ancient times to punish slaves. That's why the pelourinho in Salvador. But I call that the pillaring of Carmela in social media. That is a torturing of her person. She had to live locked up for no reason. There was never a lockup in Uruguay. Please, the next. I'm close to the end, very close. So, what is the reason? Uruguay is ruled by a mesocratic mentality. There is a love of people boast of not boasting, which is the worst kind of boasting. It's hypocritical, right? And so long before the whole media system, with endorsement of the political establishment, promulgated and prejudged the guilt of Carmela Ontu, there was in place, I quote Peirce, a mentality or flavor of mediation, which is Peirce's categorical theory. In his categorical theory is the firstness of thirdness. The next. For the mentality of Uruguayan society, she was already guilty. Just like the planets, I write, in our solar system orbit around a huge glowing star, the fertile and negative semiotic productivity aimed against this woman, Carmela, kept orbiting around her elegant and refined face, as if society suffered from facial philia, an abnormal attention to facial features, her features. The next. I'm getting really to the end, I promise. The massive media and iconic and symbolic representation of the face of Carmela Ontu, the alleged and wrong super spreader of COVID-19, was used as the imaginary iconic evidence. It was a flimsy but powerful basis to condemn her and to cruelly exile her from society. The next. So, what happens when the mental and spontaneous elements in life decrease due to an inordinate and unhealthy growth, as in a cancerous tumor, of the material of wooden dualism? This is Peirce, wooden dualism. And a person is condemned to exist as a single and movable fabricated identity. This is what Vincent Colapietro called in his 1999 work, a sign cut off from future interpreters. The next. This is how you freeze the self. Each and every self-satisfied gesture made by Carmela from 2018 in a silly TV program, which was to market her fashion products, okay? She did fur for women, okay, fur fashion, was taken as evidence of her alleged crime against the good life in mesocracy in 2020. So a program from 2018 on television. Carmela's face fully satisfied the massive facial philia of mesocratic society. And the last one, okay, here maybe. Okay, this is a capture, a screenshot from that TV program. Can we skip, okay? The next, I want to reach really the last, that's enough about the case study. Okay, here. The iconic signs of this radiant posh face affect every person who lives according to mesocratic mentality, regardless of gender, political affiliation, or worldview. The reason for this is that the firstness of thirdness, as Peirce wrote, the peculiar flavor or color or mediation of mentality escapes detection, which is what happens to somebody, I quote Peirce again, who never takes off his blue spectacles, soon ceases to see the blue tinge, end of quote. And the next. If we are unaware of this ideological tinge, we will end up splitting experience in unconnected chunks of being, ruled by efficient causation. There is no growth of reasonableness. If society explains a hugely complex phenomenon such as the syndemic of COVID-19 in a simplified reductionistic manner. And can we skip because they're too complex? I just want to go to the very end, please, Felipe, okay? To the two last slides. These are wonderful quotes from Ransdell and from William James, but there is no time. I think I ran well ahead of the allotted time. So I want to go to the last two who don't belong to a semiotician, okay? Not from Peirce, not from Ransdell, Colapietro, Santaella. Please, the last two slides. No, the last two. I will skip this and I skip this. Yeah. Thus spoke, thank you, Felipe. Sorry for rushing you. Dr. John Ioannidis. Ioannidis, I cannot read because it's too small, but he's the top epidemiologist in the world, I would say. And this he wrote on September 8th. He said, everything that mattered was affected by science, by scientists interpreting science, and by those who impose measures based on their interpretations of science in the context of political warfare. Warfare, he said, not political policy. The next. Even the best peer-reviewed journals often presented results with bias and spin. Spin means bullshit, means using it to make profit, and that's horrible. The next. Remember, this is Ioannidis, not an ignorant charlatan in social media. Big tech companies, wrote Ioannidis, which gain trillions of dollars in cumulative market value from the virtual transformation of human life during lockdown, develop powerful censorship machineries that skew the information available to users on their platform. If this is not blocking the way of inquiry, what is? The next. Unconflicted scientists who work pro bono, but dare to question dominant narratives were smeared as being conflicted. Organized skepticism was seen as a threat to public health. There was a clash, writes Ioannidis, between two schools of thought, authoritarian public health versus science, and science lost. And the very last slide from Ioannidis, with which I want to finish this homage to Peirce and to the Peirce community that keeps it alive, like you people in Brazil, like Lucia and Winfried and Vincent and everyone involved here. And so my last slide, okay, is, I think, a lesson that Peirce would have appreciated. I don't know if it's coming. Yes. One more. No. Okay. Maybe I can. Okay. Here it is. Wrote Ioannidis, I worry that science and its norms have shared the fate of the disadvantaged. It is a pity because science can still help everyone. Science can still help everyone. Science remains the best thing that can happen to humans, provided it can be both tolerant and tolerated. This is from an essay I invite you to read called How the Pandemic is Changing the Norms of Science. And I thank you all for your patience, and I hope my points, some of them at least, became clear. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Fernando. And I invite Lucia Santaella to make her comments.
Good morning. Thank you, Fernando Andacht, for your always brilliant lecture. When we call you to come to São Paulo, you always come as an intellectual present. Thank you very much. According to Peirce's pragmaticism, the meaning of an intellectual concept consists of the sensible effects that will be produced in the long course of time. The title, Remember Peirce, chosen for this event, was designed in light of this maxim. I mean, the question behind the title is, what are the pragmatic consequences of Peirce's philosophy for the challenges we are facing in the contemporary world? Andacht's text is aimed very precisely at discussing this issue. I will not ask you, Fernando, any questions about this text, given the most perfect agreement of my thought in relation to what is proposed in your text. Your paper reached me in the rightest time. The cultural and political situation that immerses us in the most extreme antagonisms has turned me into a kind of guerrilla fighter against exclusive dualisms. The diagnosis of the ailments of this situation has been pointed out by many people. However, what's up to us is to go beyond the diagnosis and seek the whys and hows of the antagonisms. I think that Peirce, as you have clearly show it, indicates the ways to do this. These are the paths of your paper, the paths that your paper signals. And it's along them that I intend to proceed in accordance with Vincent Colapietro's call for catching up, going beyond, and simply going on. In my case now, I have to declare modestly, I will simply go on. In Peirce's thought, dichotomies do not fit. This does not mean that they don't exist, but when they are exclusive, they end up turning off all the mediation lights. Western culture in general, is populated with nests and broods of dualisms that establish cleavages between realms that in reality are inseparable, interacting and complementary. Thus, for example, the separation between the realm of culture and the realm of nature, as if culture had not sprouted from the bosom of nature, a nature that humans have always transformed, and by transforming it, also transform human nature itself. This master dichotomy is followed by the dissociation between the arrogant knowing subject and the submitted object of knowledge. From these cleavages, all others derive. Peirce professed, as Andacht has shown, Peirce professed continuity as the universal foundation of metaphysics. The discontinuous exists, but it's always singular, contingent, and sooner or later it tends towards integration in generality. This question is certainly one of the most complex in Peirce's work, the question of the mathematical basis of continuity. However, its mention, even in brief, is important to support the assertion that the dichotomies which, moreover, infest contemporary life and thought with all the consequences that it brings are the result of a simplistic and poorly elaborated logic. It is this logic that commands the illusion that the human relationship with the other and with the world around us is the result of a centered subject of a perception and knowledge. As far as I can see, there is no master-slave. I'm reporting to a chapter in Hegel. There is no master-slave dialectic that can, in fact, resolve the dilemma without having to resort to a triadic logic, which Jacques Lacan, for example, resorted to in his postulation of the three registers of the human condition: the imaginary, the symbolic, and the real. And let us say that he was inspired in Peirce. Although Peirce's triadic logic, or the logic of relations, is based on a discourse of scientific precision, which rebounds in semiotics, they make their fundamental appearance in a milder version, that is, the phenomenological version, which is the starting point and key to the originality of which the triadicity of Peirce's thought derives. I often call his phenomenology an open-air exploration of our being in the world. A vast world, as the poem of Carlos Drummond de Andrade says, vast world, which today exposes itself in its challenging hyper-complexity. Peirce did not have to resort to the ritualistic protocols of a transcendental subject, as did Russell, who earned over Peirce the fame of founder of phenomenology. However, it was Peirce who provided us with a vague compass of guidance in the infinite multiplicity with which reality appears to us living beings in the vicissitudes of experience by giving us three universal categories, the most universal and general among all possible categories. As they are universal, they do not erase the specific categories of scientific regionalities, but they provide us with a territory recognition map that helps to detect the most fundamental aspects of any and all reality, of any and all experience. The technical names of these categories are firstness, secondness, and thirdness. For an orientation to those who are unfamiliar, which is not the case in this meeting, because we belong to this community, they correspond to the universe of qualities and feelings, the universe of action and reaction, ego, non-ego, surprise and conflict, and the universe of intelligence, time, learning, and becoming, corresponding respectively to firstness, secondness, and thirdness. One does not exclude the other. They are omnipresent, but there are situations in which one dominates over the other. Absorbing the real nature of these categories helps us to understand the originality of Peirce's semiotics and consequently to think triadically. That's the real issue, to learn to think triadically, far from the dichotomies that place human thought, feelings, and acting in opposite extremes that hide the richness in filigree of everything that lies between the antagonisms and oppositions. Now I come to the triadic key of semiosis. In fact, one of the most original features of Peirce's work is found in the triadic logic of the sign. It's not by chance that semiotics is in the heart of Peirce's philosophy. It functions as a dynamic logical model in perpetual movement and becoming, responsible for the process of the growth of science, depending on the interpretations that humans are capable of producing at each moment of their history. On the other hand, today, unfortunately, a large part of the interpretations do not go beyond cacophonies, clichés, and even falsehoods. On the other hand, luckily, this does not manage to cancel out interpretative gems that circulate through the networks and that now even inhabit the palm of our hands. Therefore, it's urgent that we develop triadic interpretations against the mechanistic and Cartesian heritage that still persists. The West, due to the dualistic nature of Indo-European languages, is a victim of the incurable plague of dichotomies. Many years ago, I read a passage by Peirce, capable of giving a fair and precious explanation of the reasons why the incorporation of a triadic way of thinking is so difficult for most people. The idea stayed in my mind, in my memory, but I was never able to find that passage again. I thank Winfried Noeth for rediscovering it for me in a footnote of the collected papers. Let us listen to Peirce carefully. I quote Peirce: "The Indo-European languages are singular in having the common noun distinctly and fully developed as a separate part of speech, and by more or less development even of abstract nouns. I do not mean to say," Peirce say, "that the common noun is not fully developed in any other language, but only that such a phenomenon is exceptional in every other great family of speech. This requires and evidences considerable power of thought on the part of those who use these languages, Indo-European. With the exercise of a little ingenuity, it's possible to express anything in these languages." Listen carefully now. "Provided no higher relation than dyadic ones enter. Only very simple propositions can be expressed involving higher relations." And now, Peirce finishes. "And those whose mental education is limited by the power of these languages are unable to grasp the meaning of a complex triple relation." As we can see, the culture of extremes that plagues contemporary social life in the Western world is not a result of chance. It's useless to preach against hate speeches when one remains stuck in the logic of dichotomies, which is the source of all antagonisms. Although a pioneer, Peirce is no longer alone in his quest to overcome binary oppositions. Recently, Bruno Latour hit the same key in another manner. I prefer Peirce. when diagnosing the dualist and purifying tendency of the official modern project, which establishes watertight dichotomies between society versus nature, subject versus object, mind versus matter. The great contradiction, says Latour, of this project lies in the fact that the appreciation of purisms, in fact, only seeks to hide a resulting proliferation of hybrids. Against such concealment, Latour proposes a flat epistemology brokered by actants who fulfill the mediating function between humans and non-humans. But Latour doesn't have a triadic logic. Also recent in the philosophical movement, under the name of speculative realism, that seeks ways to overcome where philosophy was stuck to from Kant onwards, and which they call the axiom of correlationism. According to correlationism, we only have access to what's given in thought and never to an entity that subsists in itself. Therefore, that's why they call realism. Therefore, we only have access to the correlation between thinking and being, never to any of these terms considered separately. This opposition to correlationism led speculative realists to shift from the centralization of thought in and with the notion of subject to speculation about the subject, which provoked, therefore, a detachment from the alleged relationship between subject and object. We have to consider that it's true that they only inverted the dual relation. But that's another story, and I will not discuss it here. There is no doubt that all these initiatives to introduce new ways of thinking are beneficial in light of the extremisms that have taken over human post-digital networks communication. Extremes often driven by hypertrophy of the self and the attachment to beliefs fueled by homophilia, attraction for everything that confirms one's fixed beliefs. The difference in relation to what Peirce presents us there, however, is that in his logic or semiotics, that is better in his logic of semiosis, in the description he gives us of the continuous dynamics of semiosis or sign action, we find the possibility of enthroning triadic ways of thinking and of acting capable of highlighting the mediations which stand between the extremisms and orthodoxies of the current cultural wars in which social groups separate and isolate themselves in identity security, a search of security which ignores that the personal and social self is defined because it faces the non-self, a confrontation that can only be overcome by conciliatory mediations without ignoring the differences that are sheltered within the identities. Therefore, it's necessary to propose a semiotic term capable of revealing the poverty of dualist and separatist thinking, incapable of overcoming or at least understanding the contradictions, paradoxes, and ambivalences that inhabit the saturation of fragmented discourses lacking in otherness. Only the opening to otherness would be able to lead to the creation of a new common that's not based on closed identity, but on the porosity to the other. As far as I can see, to conclude, a semiotic term involves giving semiotics the value it has at the heart of Peirce's philosophical edifice. This value can only be recognized when the descriptive triadicity of the categories, which reflects on the analytic semiotic triads, finds its matrix in the notion of semiosis, the action of the sign, which is synonymous with final causation, that is, intelligent action, the principle of growth and becoming that is embedded in the logical process of semiosis, works as a dynamic model for the understanding of synecism or continuity. There is no separation between the action of the sign and the understanding of synecism. I'm very emphatic about this because semiosis works as a dynamic model of continuity, which can only be continuity tout court because it properly challenges. It is properly challenged by chance and by the insistence of the real, the three categories. This is only the starting point of a series of master keys necessary to think triadically, which is the royal way to put dichotomies in their proper place in order to prevent them from acting as extreme pathologies. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Lucia. Fernando Andacht, you can...
Thank you. I'm extremely grateful, Lucia, for the invitation, for being here between commas or without them, because we are in the spirit of Peircean community, and that's what matters. I love the idea of a semiotic turn. There's been so much made of the linguistic turn and the iconic turn to no avail. So why not to accept that it's time for a semiotic turn and to think triadically? And if you allow me, when you were speaking, I couldn't mention because time was running out, but somebody we both admire and we have learned so much from, a lovely friend, Joseph Ransdell, who I quote in the paper and I couldn't show. He wrote in 1986, over 30 years ago, 35 years ago, what is at the bottom of the distinctively modern mentalities, what Lucia talked about, this dualistic, right, reductionistic and impoverishing mentality, is the belief, writes Ransdell, that we can be the masters of everything. The mastery of words and signs being a relatively easy part of that. They seem so malleable. He uses the word malleable. And I found in James' 7th lecture on pragmatism in 1907, William James, he wrote, "We add both to the subject and to the predicate part of reality. the world stands really malleable. There you go again, malleable, that is, you can manipulate it, right? Waiting to receive its final touches at our hands. Like the kingdom of heaven, writes William James, it suffers human violence willingly. Man engenders truths upon it. I am not so optimistic as James. I think that what Lucia has just said, and if anything in my own text, as Peirce used to say, by their fruits you shall recognize them, influence that thought, I am already happy and satisfied that those signs reached to her with something useful. I would say that we not only engender truth, we engender lies, we engender splits, rifts that makes us antagonists when we need union more than ever. This is the paradox. We need to be united more than ever in the face of an enigma, of something that overcomes us in every aspect of life. If there ever was a challenge for Seneca, it is now. Now, more than in a war, more than ever. And first, I think it was so great to call it the Peirce, remembering Peirce, because what is the resistance to semiotics? That is my theory. Why is semiotics so thought against, right? I think that you touched upon something precious, which is triadic thinking, and not denying diets, of course, but trying to find a bridge, something that connects culture and nature, man and woman, and the very name of cultural wars, as Ioannidis was saying, when there is a war, there is no room for doubt. What did Peirce said? Without the irritation of doubt, there is no inquiry. Inquiry comes from quaero, question. Nowadays, we're afraid of asking the wrong question, and that is awful. That is the worst possible fate for science, for the legacy of Peirce, because Peirce, in his wonderful fixation of belief, said that the scientific method approaches the real as something upon which human beings have no influence. That's the only warranty of ever knowing the real. And that, as you so nicely said, is the union of the three valencies or categories: the feeling, the fact, and the law, the regularity, the predictability. And Joe Ransdell understood that, I think, earlier and better than anyone else, together with people like you and Vincent and Winfried and many others in the community, that when he wrote in 1989, the same year as Vincent's book, I heard him in Perpignan. He wrote on the autonomy and teleology of science. It's a paper I recommend to everyone. It's 5 pages, but you have to read it many times. The autonomous and teleological nature of science. That's where everything lies. As Lucia, I think, has explained it in a superb fashion, right? Until we understand that lesson, I think it will take a long time yet, but I'm hopeful. I'm hopeful that mankind will learn the lesson of Peirce, but it's thanks to communities like this one, okay? Where people believe and fight against all the odds, and thank Priscilla for organizing against all the odds this meeting, okay? Because without the materialization of science, there is no growth of reasonableness. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, Santaella and Andacht. We have a question that came from Colapietro early this morning, so I will read it and then we pass to the other ones that have written in the chat. Thank you for your wonderful presentations. This is a question for both Fernando and Lucia. Given the havoc, impasses, and pain wrought by fractured and mutilated continua in contemporary life, do we not, as synecists, have a responsibility to focus on the therapeutic dimension of the traumas resulting from these fragmentations and mutilations? Is not one of the functions of art, in effect, even apart from the intent of the artist, therapeutic, in both restoring a sense of continuity and helping us to live with rupture? Is not therapy itself an art aiming to restore continuity, but also to learn how to accept, in some respects, rupture, fragmentation, and disjunction, For example, the disjunct of the individual's life before and after being sexually abused as a child. The focus on this therapeutic dimension is as old as Plato and as contemporary as at least James and Wittgenstein. Should it not also be the focus of synecists? Thank you.
You, Fernando.
I go first? Okay. First of all, I thank my dear friend and colleague Vincent, okay, who's following us somewhere in the north of our continent for this wonderful question. There is the so-called PST, post-shock trauma. I think humanity at present, Vincent, is undergoing the duress of a post-shock trauma. We are living in hardship. We are living without hugs. We are living in social distance, a masked existence with so much confusion. And people, more than anything, I've been writing about this since 2020, some 15 essays I've written already. We are in fear. In fear, no growth of reasonableness. We live in a panic-stricken world where the media are profiting enormously from frightening the population, making us scared of ourselves. I just heard a conversation somebody allowed me, and this is a concrete true example from like a week ago. Somebody was organizing a party, yes, a party, small party of people, a meeting. In my country, supposedly 72% of the people are vaccinated, okay? And so this person in concrete happens because she has an immune deficiency. She has been vaccinated 4 times, yes, 4 times, 4, not 3, not 2, 4. And the person whose house, you see, was being used to the party said, I could hear her, I couldn't believe it, but I heard it several times, said, sorry, so-and-so, I don't want you in my house. I don't want you to come to my house because I know you can still be a source of contagion, like poor Carmela, right? You can be an untore. You can be an agent of contagion. No matter if you take 7, she actually said 7 shots, 7 shots, I don't want you in my house. If this is the future of mankind, if this is where we're going, okay, this is only the upshot, as Lucia just said beautifully, of the pragmatic maxim. What is the consequence when mankind defines by isolation, by fear of the other, by secluding ourselves forever and forever becoming obsessed with our health? That is the most unhealthy possible consequence for humanity. That cannot be. And so thank you for this idea of therapy. I believe that semiotic has an immense future as a therapy. And Lucia already said, the semiotic term, triadic thinking, means opening ourselves to otherness, as I'm just quoting Lucia here, because this trauma, ongoing trauma, is not benefiting us at all. Not benefiting society, not benefiting science. As Ioannidis, I showed you his essay from September the 8th, right now, 2021. So where is the debate? Where is the healthy exchange that Peirce thought was inquiry? Inquiry is the therapy. And the last thing I say, and I let the word to my friend and colleague Lucia, that therapy, be psychoanalytic, be psychodrama, whichever. I always remember that Moreno, Jacob Levi Moreno, who lived in the States, quotes Peirce and says, there is a philosopher in 1947, there is a philosopher called Charles Sanders Peirce who has a theory of spontaneity. Lucia, it's firstness. And he admires Peirce. He says he discovered him in 1947. He says he has an amazing thing to say about spontaneity. And life is about spontaneity. What can be less spontaneous than keeping the other away, that telling the other, no matter how many times you vaccinate, how many shots, I don't want you near. That is the end of society, of everything that Vincent wrote about when he said that we are at the mesh of sociability, that society is what makes us what we are, for good and for bad. But dualism is the source of all fear, the obsession with dying. We're all going to die. The big question that philosophy asks is, how do we want to live if we're all going to die, right? the big question, and Socrates again is the example. Ransdell always used to say, remember, that Peirce was a Socratic thinker. Amen to that. And that is the question that Peirce puts to us in 2021. How are we going to live? In the prison house of science, condemned to isolated, not bubbles, but jail, cells, prison, or going out and finding out for ourselves what is the truth, what is the inquiry. That is the fourth method of science, applied in science, in the lab, and in life, because Peirce was synergistic through and through, synergistic through and through. There is continuity in all inquiries, not just those in a laboratory, but those that we are carrying out right now. And when this encounter finishes, we will keep on thinking. And I love those who will be in total disagreement with me or with Lucia or with Vincent, because that is the heart of science, to disagree, to dialogue, to think, not to banish, not to ban, not to cancel, not to censor. All that is the fear of truth. The fear of truth is dualistic. Thank you, Vincent.
Well, I'll give a brief answer to Vincent. Fernando, I'm sorry, but I cannot disagree with you and with Vincent. Well, that is, it's difficult to explain. Of course, you are not the same as I am, but there is a kind of complementation and of taking ahead what Vincent said. It's not a catching up, and to a certain extent, I go beyond myself when I listen to you and to Vincent. It's not by chance that we invite you every event that we organize, in the sense that we think together. That's the word. We are able to think together and to collaborate in our differences. Well, what I want to say to Vincent is that this idea of that you brought, the therapeutic, I think that's a kind of promise, of a therapeutic promise that we bring with semiotics. That means with the effort of understanding this triadic way of thinking. Well, what I have to tell you, it's a coincidence, because I just edited. I have a collection that I organize, which is called Interrogations. And we have already 12 books published, small books. They ask questions. And the book I edited recently is, the title is, look at the coincidence. The title is Is it possible to sublimate trauma? I think that this book gives an answer to Vincent's question, because the question is, can sublimation overcome trauma? The book is very interesting because there is an empirical, it's based on an empirical research with abandoned children. And the result was very positive, because to a certain extent, although Peirce didn't, not Peirce, Freud, didn't develop very much the idea of sublimation, this research, to a certain extent, proved that sublimation can, to a certain extent, overcome trauma. So, which is our sublimation? Is what we do. It's what we have been doing for years, for decades. Yesterday, I counted for how many years I have been teaching Peirce. You are not going to believe, 45. 45 years. So it's a kind of therapeutic against trauma. And I think that what Fernando and I brought this morning is an answer. What shall we do? Continue what we have been doing for decades. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.
We have a question from Jefferson. I think, yeah. As group behavior became a matter of life and death, decisive for the fight against the virus, how could public communication have been done differently without putting lives at risk? And then he continues, did we have time to embrace the complexity of triadic thinking in this scenario?
I thank Jefferson, who was a brilliant student of mine, a PhD, now he's a doctor in communication. So thank you, Jefferson. It's a wonderful. In one of my essays from 2020, I show some of the screenshots, right, taken from the news in my country. In a literal sense, the media, television, had a revival, yeah, and they developed a horrible scenario. They first had a still huge image of coronavirus, right? And then they started moving, animating it, right? And I show pictures as indexical, right? Iconic indexical hypo-icons, as Peirce would say. I think that the worst possible thing is to frighten the population, because biologically it's bad, because people, you know, we are machines producing energy, biological machines. But adrenaline is what we produce when we are in front of a crisis, right? But crises, by definition, always have to be short-lived. They cannot last 2 years. Nobody can survive a crisis of 2 years, right? So you face a lion. You're walking through the forest and there's a lion and you have a pumping adrenaline and that produces a stress. But that's a good stress because it helps you to think quickly. What do I do? What do I do, right? I run, I go up a tree, what do I do? But when you have a captive population, literally, people, there was no lockdown in Uruguay, no lockdown in 2020, like Argentina, like Chile, other countries, no lockdown for the pandemic. But people were so scared, and the shopping malls, everything was closed, education centers were closed, everything. So people had nowhere to go. And they stay at home, and what did they do? They watch obsessively, right? News media that went more or less to the triple of their length. That's crazy. They went from, say, 3 hours to 9, 10 hours a day in every network. And what is wrong with that? What is wrong with that? Many things are wrong, as I tried to explain, using the fixation of belief. Okay, this is published in a I don't know how to call it. It's a publication by intellectuals in Uruguay, right? And we translate things like Ioannidis and so on. It's called Extramuros, outside the walls of the city, because what was terribly wrong was unanimity. In all the networks, in every single radio, in every single TV network, the same cast, the same people appeared telling the same narrative. For example, lynching Carmela Untu, pointing out that she was the monster, she was the contagious agent. That only fed hatred, that only fed mistrust and fear, crazy fear. People who are in fear do not think well, right? You have to outlive a crisis by being more reasonable than ever. So you asked me, what was the alternative? A million alternatives, but the basic alternative was to have a debate. to have the different scientific voices, not charlatans, not people in the street. I'm talking about molecular biologists, epidemiologists who had a different take on the pandemic. That was censored. That was absolutely excluded. That's anti-Peircean 100%. What is cynicism, people? What is cynicism? It's the principle of continuity. It's a range of different voices trying to understand a super difficult problem. Is it a virus that was born, you see, biologically because of bats in a marketplace or producing a lab? All that is complex. I do not claim to understand a single thing about it, but I do understand about the need to think triadically, as Lucia so pertinently said, and that means not to exclude anyone from this large community which has no definite limits. And I just told the anecdote, which may be stupid and is trivial, about this person telling to a very good friend, a schoolmate for 40 years, do not come near my house. You have 4 shots, but I am afraid of you. You see, and even if you take 7 shots of Pfizer now, because vaccines have become like Nike and Adidas brands, okay, part of the marketing experience that makes billionaires of some people, do not come to my house. This is an exile of life. How can she tell this to this poor person who has taken 4 shots and saying, do not come close to me, because even though you're vaccinated, you're a menace to me, you're a threat. People are not a threat. Think about children. Think about children. What have we done to children? Children are the future of mankind. How can you tell them, as it was told in Uruguay, that they are the murderers of the grandparents? That is obscene. That's an obscenity. Children didn't kill anyone at all, with intent or no intent, because they never caught it seriously. It was absolutely exceptional. But the urban legend remains that children were dangerous, and so they couldn't see their grandparents for a year. That is a monstrosity. And what is worse, and Peirce is always right, is we talked about yesterday in the afternoon with Lucia in an exchange, the dynamical object only reveals itself gradually, and the final interpreter is in the horizon that science pursues. So you cannot exclude a priori anyone. That's called authority method. That is called a priori method. The 3 methods are no good for handling a crisis like the pandemic one. We cannot deal fear as we're fabricating horrible stories. We cannot tell children they are going to kill the grandparents. That is a monstrosity. And teenagers are now being vaccinated. And there are many, many studies in Sweden, in everywhere in Europe, saying that they don't need teenagers. They don't need. But why are they accepting it? Because they want to return to life. They want to be sociable again. Of course, they're being vaccinated. What I'm saying is, let's keep skepticism alive. Let's drive fear away. Fear was never a good advisor in life. People who are frightened, who are in panic, right? They ran out of a theater and killed everyone in the rush to escape a fire. When was fear and frightened population a good thing? Only in tyrannies, 1984. Why did they have the 3 minutes of hate in George Orwell's 1948 novel 1984? Because that's how you control people, by making them scared to death of themselves, because they're being spied upon, because they are being stopped to think freely. When Lucia speaks of triadic thinking, I think of freedom. I think of democracy. I lived through a dictatorship. In Brazil, you lived through a dictatorship, right? In the 70s, we also lived. And what was the most horrible crime? The thought crime, Orwell's idea. The face crime. There is a face crime in 1984. When you're watching the 3 minutes of fear, if you are not, you see, angry against this guy called Goldstein, I think, Emmanuel Goldstein, a Jewish hated character, you are suspicious. You are denounced. It's Ioannidis who says this, not me, who is an ignorant of biology. He's the top leading epidemiologist of the world from Stanford University. He's saying this is a war. And in war, any who is skeptical must be shot. Anyone, and who loses? Science. See, Peirce, I wouldn't say ever that he would say what I'm saying. No, we must catch up, right? We must get ahead, or as Lucia wisely said, and Vincent, we must go on. I like to go on thinking that some of his ideas are still relevant today to make a better use of our intelligence, to learn from what is happening to us instead of being cowed and frightened, locked up in our houses and losing. We are all losing in this war. Thank you, Jefferson.
We have another question from Soraya. Actually, we have many questions, so we had to run on time here, but I will try to make all the questions that appeared. What is the role of collateral experience? How can collateral experience make fallibilism possible? So that's for you, Fernando. You can.
Do you want to answer? Fernando?
Just a brief thing, we're running out of time. Thank you, Soraya. Love to see you, not seeing you again, Soraya. I saw her last in Sao Paulo. Remember, Lucia, at the seminar you invited me, wonderful seminar at the PUC-SP. A collateral experience is damaged by dualism. Dualism puts blinders, right? Like horses, you know, the blinders. It doesn't want you to see what you're not supposed to see. When peer-reviewed journals like The Lancet, right, have to withdraw some article, but the mass media doesn't tell you about the withdrawal. They only tell you about what they first published because of political bias. I'm not siding with any politician. I'm saying that collateral experience, right, is precisely what possesses the familiarity with the world, right? Remember the example he did, right, Lucia, is when Teddy Roosevelt is at a party and you point to him, to somebody and say, look who's in the party. And the person doesn't know because has never seen, it's before television, right? It's in Peirce's times, who is what Teddy Roosevelt looks like. And so he nudges, says, look at him. And what is lacking is collateral experience. He doesn't know what Teddy Roosevelt looks like. So for him, it's just a mustached big guy in the party. So collateral experience is what the semiotic gives us. You see, triadic is an enormous important to experience, right? Experience is the matrix of everything. And when he explains that a man who's wearing blue spectacles all the time can no longer perceive blue, the blue tinge, this is what's happening when we are drowned in a hyperinflation of media narrative. It's an enormous media narrative and it's monological. And so you stop thinking for yourself. And that's the worst thing you can ever do. We must think for ourselves. You don't have to agree with anything I said. But if I set you thinking for yourself, saying, I think Fernando was wrong through and through, that's great, because you have to look for arguments. You have to look for claims. Was Peirce wrong, or was I wrong about my take on Peirce? Maybe, who knows, right? But definitely, I think it's a syndemic. I think that it affects the economy, the psychology, the living together, affects everything. Never an epidemic before was so complex. Never, ever it stopped the world from functioning as we know it. And so how can we be dualistic about it? How can we divide between good and evil, between the right people and the wrong people? Or as this poor woman, okay, who was serially vaccinated, be prevented from joining life again? That's a monstrosity, that's cruel. Or how can a woman be called patient zero when there is no evidence? And in fact, it was soon found out that she was not patient zero, but up to today, if you Google in Uruguay or in your own country, of course, Carmela Ontu, it will say, she is the contagious, she's the super drive of contagion. That's not true, but nobody cares about the truth in dualism. It's only about forcefulness, brute force, dyadic force, and who has the stronger force? The one who has the power of the media, who can control the narrative and tell you whatever they like. So collateral experience is precisely what makes the world of semiosis go round. Thank you, Soraya.
Exactly. Soraya, to my students, I say that the collateral experience is when we search for other signs which can complement the sign that's presented to us. So it's connected with fallibilism because we live in a myriad of signs, in a constellation of signs. So it's connected with fallibilism when we come to the conclusion that the knowledge that we have is incomplete. And so we go to collateral experience, looking for other signs that can bring and enrich our interpretation. It's connected with fallibilism, no doubt. Thank you for the question.
There's another one from Cassiano. Peirce stresses the power of brutal facts, of secondness, as the most powerful correction of errors and sole authority as concerns truth. There's a continuation of it. Okay, how can we define what is right or wrong, what is scientific or sham reasoning, without resorting to facts? Isn't the appeal to other people's honors a sort of fallacy of authority?
I'm not sure I understood the last part, but definitely the first part. Thank you, Cassiano, and a big hug, abrazo from Montevideo. Again, I missed the after party with you, but thank you for your question. I think that the legacy of Peirce, right, and I know I'm talking to a Peirce scholar, right, who studied in Indianapolis, right, at the first, I studied at the Research Center where I met, I think I saw again Lucia. I think we had met before, right, when Silvio was alive, but for a shorter time, so maybe you know more about Peirce than me, but still, I dare to speak. Since I was invited, I will speak. I think that overemphasizing facts against the telic thing, right? Part of the fact is the enormous political intricacy of this pandemic since March 2020. That is also a hard fact. A hard fact is that from the beginning, right, the world was divided, as I tried to explain, through a brutal rift. In Spanish, it's a beautiful word, grieta. Grieta is a wonderful word, right? It's so euphonic. It's like a slap in the face. It was impossible. I've been observing, right, different states, different governments, how they handle the pandemic, and very few people, right? I follow a Swedish doctor called Sebastian Rushworth, has a wonderful blog, okay? He's a specialist in evidence-based medicine, so there you go for the facts. But Sweden, to say something, right? Sweden was a pariah. Sweden was the first country that not only did not go to lockdown in 2020, they kept the schools open. They kept the schools open. They kept social life going on. There were even parties up to 50 people, for instance, right? And the results will only be told in the long run, but so far, what is called the mortality, right, the lethality, etc., is no different from the other countries, or even much better than countries like Argentina, where there were like 7 lockdowns, terrible lockdowns, Chile also, right? So if we go to the facts, Cassiano, one of the facts involved is the political bias, the ideological bias was never separate, was intricately part of this dualistic machinery of trying to punish a political leader that you hate, right, by associating it with the bad management of a biological crisis. That's a recipe for disaster. And it's never the outward clash alone. Of course, Peirce said the outward clash, the correction of experience. Of course he did. But he also spoke, remember, Cassiano, of the telic drive, the teleology, that is interpretation. Lucia was speaking of, yeah, right, triadic thinking. What is the growth of reasonableness? Is he calls, I think, scientific intelligences those beings who are capable of learning. But learning is a teleological process. If you stop at the facts, you are a positivist. You're not a person. That is, you have to digest, metabolize whatever comes from the world and try to come to terms with it, right? Just like Vincent said, catching up, right? Getting ahead or going on. The 3 things at the same time. I am not claiming that I understand this pandemic better than you. You probably are willing to throw at me the number of dead people. But even the inventor of the PCR test, right, Kary Mullis, has said very bad things about the PCR test. Unfortunately, he died before the crisis, right? That it was no good as a diagnosis tool. The inventor of the PCR test that was used to make the cases, how many cases you have. But where there are those cases? I'm using the facts for you. That is, we have the fact that the scientists who won a Nobel Prize, right, for inventing this test said the test is no good. It's still no good today, but it's very useful for governments who first frighten to death the people, then they bring this magical potion, this talisman, right? It says now everybody can be happy, but then the happiness is short-lived because they have to keep on being happy by getting shots. And as this friend, I'm not going to reveal the identity of, said, you can take 7 of them, still I'm not admitting you into my house. You must keep away at a distance. So yes, facts are important, but so is the metabolizing of facts into learning. And one fact I insist is the polarization, the political polarization of this pandemic, which is in no way biological alone. It's in part biological, in part economic, in part political. It involves a million hard facts. If you only look at the biology and you tell me, yes, but there were so many dead people, were they really died of that? Nobody knows. Because Peirce trusted in the long run. And we're not in the long run. This began only a year and a half or a bit more ago. How can we be how can anybody be so sure? Then you fall into the COVID orthodoxy. In that region of the world, yes, you can be sure about it, but then it's Lucia again. Where is fallibilism? Isn't fallibilism objectified clinicism? I'm quoting Lucia. Yes, it is. So how can we be so dogmatic about it? Dogma and science are not good bedfellows. Dogma and science can never. Anything I said today is probably wrong. Everything I said and anything I said can be shown to be wrong. But at least I'm opening the irritation of doubt. You're doubting. And that is already for me a reward. Thank you, Casiano. Grande abrazo, amigo.
We have one last question from Isabel. Agave for Peirce is the major evolutionary gentle force in nature and for mankind. What science that can help spread and grow real agape can be propagated by us?
We're in the jungle of metaphysics. Yes, wonderful, right? Isabel, I was so happy to listen to you yesterday in the Jornadas Peirceanas. This is section Jornadas Peirceanas. I love your presentation. Isabel was coming to Uruguay in 2020. What a pity we missed her because the pandemic caught up with us. So it was a kind of antidote to the loss of your talk in Uruguay. But what I loved about the presentation, much better than mine, in fact, of Isabel Jung yesterday, is because she united the 3 categories, firstness, secondness, and thirdness, with the 4 methods to fix belief, right? She, for example, said that tenacity and authority correspond to, I think, let me get it right. A priori was the firstness, right? You cannot correct me, but a priori was firstness, and tenacity and authority secondness. I think I got it right, right? And only the method of science, the 4th method, corresponds to thirdness. And so agapism is the beautiful way you put it. You put it in a way to reconcile people about the doubts that you harbor, and which I so much appreciated, because it's very brave. Isabel, listen, it's very courageous to speak in Brazil. In Uruguay, you have to be courageous to speak like I'm speaking, right? And this shows you that Peirce was right. Because if people are hating me already, right, or are objecting to me in a dogmatic way, it's because Peirce is right. Dualism is wrong. Dualism is the axe that cuts everything into unrelated chunks of being, because nothing can be explained. It only makes 2 enemies, right? I hate you and you stay over there, and that's not science. That is not agapism. Agapism is sharing ideas, sharing the love of thinking, of learning together. And I think this community of Peircean people that was initiated and led by Lucia Santaella for so many years, and I thank you for that. It's a wonderful work for mankind, is an example of agapism. You see, not even the pandemic could stop us, people. We are heroes. She's a guerrillera. She's a warfare fighter for cynicism. And I think you're all fighters for free thinking. Free thinking is the antidote. More than vaccines, more than masks, more than social distance, is the freedom of thought. And it will take a lot to convince me that Peirce was not in favor of the freedom of thought. I quote him for the last time. No is the pivot of thought. Say no to me, but say no to the media, say no to the narrative. Saying no is the beginning of finding the truth. You see, people, as William James said, do not engender only truths upon the universe. They also engender lies, all kinds of lies, even those they are convinced they are true. Probably because every belief per se, if we have the belief, we are convinced it's true. Otherwise, it wouldn't be a belief, right? But thank you a lot, Isabel, for your agapistic presentation of yesterday and for this wonderful question.
Great. I would like to thank Fernando Andacht and Lucia Santaella. We are almost finishing our session, and so I want to end this session of the Advanced Seminar. I will invite all of you to the session we are going to have in the evening, but I would like to make to give some words to the ending of this great seminar we had here. But I will do it in Portuguese since most of our audience is in Portuguese, and I know that Fernando can follow it. So, e aí queria agradecer também, né, todo mundo que faz parte da organização e que nos apoiou formando essa comunidade peirceana em São Paulo, e que hoje está espalhada pelo país, que é um pouco do que a gente vai apresentar hoje na rede CIEP, né? Essa ideia de construir uma rede brasileira. E aí, por fim, eu queria encerrar, então, dizendo que é difícil conciliar o cinequismo com princípios aristocráticos que produziram sociedades profundamente injustas e desiguais. Peirce foi capaz de perceber o cinequismo no universo e ainda assim morreu 26 anos após o último país das Américas ter abolido a escravidão, que foi o Brasil, sem deixar de defender a escravidão. Assunto lembrado por Michael Raposa em sua palestra como presidente da Charles Sanders Peirce Society em 8 de janeiro de 2021, recentemente publicada na Transactions. Lembrar Peirce hoje inclui o desafio de lidar com um pensamento tão brilhante e um ser humano tão contraditório como somos todos nós. 107 anos após a morte de Peirce, sua opinião pessoal se provou errada, mas a sua teoria científica e filosófica vem se confirmando. Quero encerrar essa sessão lendo um breve trecho do Peirce, mas não do Peirce melancólico, de uma carta de 1908, que eu encontrei recentemente, em que ele manifesta suas posições pessoais, mas do Peirce de 1878, no texto The Doctrine of Chance. Ele fala: aquilo que, sem a morte, viria a acontecer com cada ser humano, com a morte deve acontecer apenas com alguns. Ao mesmo tempo, a morte torna o número de nossos riscos e de nossas inferências finito, bem como torna a média de seus resultados incerta. A própria ideia de probabilidade e o próprio raciocínio se baseiam na presunção de que este número é infinitamente grande. Estamos, portanto, parados diante da mesma dificuldade para a qual eu só consigo ver uma única saída, diz Peirce. Creio que somos levados a reconhecer que a lógica exige, inexoravelmente, que nosso interesse não seja limitado. Ele não pode se limitar a nosso próprio destino, mas deve abraçar toda a comunidade. A comunidade, por sua vez, também não pode ser limitada, mas deve se estender a todas as raças de seres com os quais podemos vir a ter relações intelectuais com ou sem mediação. Ela deve se expandir, não importa quão vagamente, para além desta era geológica, além de todos os limites. Qualquer um que não esteja disposto a sacrificar a sua própria alma para salvar o mundo inteiro é, como me parece, ilógico coletivamente em todas as suas inferências. A lógica está enraizada no princípio social. E aí eu agradeço a todos por essa excelente semana, pelas excelentes reflexões. Muito obrigado e aguardo vocês à tarde para o nosso encontro da rede. Obrigada, Fernando.
Obrigado, Priscila. Muito obrigado, Lúcia. Um grande abraço e foi um enorme prazer ter esse encontro, esse diálogo. Obrigado por tudo. Grande abraço.
Obrigada, Priscila. Parabéns por essa brilhante organização. Parabéns, Priscila.